The body had been buried 14 months ago. Amara had stood at the graveside herself. Black dress, borrowed grief, rain turning the cliffside cemetery soil above Naples into slick mud beneath her heels. She had watched the mahogany casket lower into the earth. She had watched the man they said was Adrian Moretti stand in silence, that terrible, swallowing silence of a man being hollowed out alive. She had witnessed the burial of Viviana Moretti. So why was Viviana Moretti standing in the doorway? "There's something I need to tell you." The words were still suspended in the air, fragile as smoke, when the door swung open. Amara felt it before she saw it, a shift in the atmosphere, the particular stillness that descends before something irreversible happens, the held breath of the universe right before it breaks a person in half. Adrian's hand was wrapped around hers, both of his hands, actually cradling her fingers the way you hold something you are terrified of dropping. His blind eyes were closed, forehead bowed against her knuckles, chest rising and falling with the unsteady rhythm of a confession in progress. He had been building toward something. She could feel the words forming inside him, pressing against the walls of his throat, gathering weight, gathering courage. "I love you." She had been certain that was where he was going. She had been wrong about a great many things. Neither of them heard the footsteps. Not the elevator, not the corridor, not the soft, deliberate click of heels that knew exactly where they were going, heels that had once walked these floors before, in another lifetime, in a life that had been sealed, shut, and buried under 14 months of mourning and roses left on stone, and a widower learning, slowly, devastatingly, how to breathe again. Then, "You always did replace things quickly." The voice entered the room before the woman did. It slid through the air like the edge of something polished and sharp, not loud, not frantic, composed, almost amused. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment so many times that reality could only disappoint her by being less dramatic than she had imagined. Adrian went completely still. Amara turned. And the world, her world, the one she had spent 14 months helping to rebuild around silence and trust and the careful architecture of daily tenderness, simply tilted. Because standing in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame with the casual elegance of someone arriving at a dinner party rather than detonating a life, was a woman who had no right to be standing anywhere. Viviana Moretti. Tall, immaculate, dark hair swept over one shoulder, lips curved into something that was almost a smile but carried the cold geometry of a weapon. She was wearing cream, of all things. Soft fabric, clean lines, no visible strain, no evidence of death, no trace of the grave. Alive. The air left Amara's lungs, not gradually, all at once, like a door slamming shut on a room with no oxygen in it. Adrian's hands released hers, not slowly, not carefully, like something inside him had recoiled on instinct. And the absence of his touch felt like the ground had been removed from beneath her feet. "Vivi." His voice broke on the second syllable, one fragment of a name he had wept over, raged over, buried. His body had gone rigid, every muscle braced against something his mind had not yet been given permission to believe. Viviana's gaze moved past him, to Amara. Slow, deliberate, surgical. "I'm sorry," she said, sounding nothing of the sort. "Have I interrupted something?" No one answered. Because what do you say to a ghost who already knows the answer? Amara could hear her own pulse, could hear Adrian's breathing too shallow now, too controlled. The breathing of a man holding himself together, by force, alone. Could hear, beneath all of it, the soft whisper of the curtains shifting in the sea breeze through the cracked window. Viviana stepped fully into the room and shut the door behind her with quiet care. Not a bang, not a flourish. A click, small, final, the kind of sound that changes the meaning of everything that comes after it. Adrian rose halfway from the chair beside his desk, then stopped. one hand flattening against the polished wood, as if to orient himself in a suddenly unfamiliar world. How? The word came out rough. Viviana's expression barely changed. That, she said, is a long story. Amara stood frozen where she was, every instinct in her body firing at once. Run, speak, move, protect him, demand answers. But all of those instincts crashed into the same impossible fact. The dead were not supposed to open doors. And yet, here she was, breathing, smiling, looking at the room as if she still owned it. What happened next would take everything, the trust, the love, the fragile future neither of them had yet said aloud, and drag it through fire. But to understand how a dead woman walks back into a living man's life, you have to go back. Before the grave, before the grief, before Amara, before the darkness. Naples does not forgive weakness. It never has. The city was built on volcanic rock and buried ambition. A place where the sea looks beautiful and the water hides bodies, where men smile at funerals and mean it. Power here is not given. It is taken and then defended with the kind of ruthlessness that does not make the newspapers because the journalists understand, with admirable survival instinct, which truths are safer left unwritten. Adrian Moretti understood this before he understood anything else. He learned it at his father's knee, in a house where silence meant danger and dinner-table conversations doubled as war councils. He inherited an empire built on fear and expanded it on something far more effective: reputation. The kind that enters rooms before you do. The kind that makes men straighten their spines and lower their voices before you have said a single word. By 34, Adrian did not need to raise his voice. He barely needed to speak. A look had once been enough. A pause. The specific stillness that settled over him when his patience expired. That cold atmospheric pressure drop his men had learned to read like a weather system. Storm incoming. Clear the room. Do not be the last one standing when it breaks. He had never lost. Not once. Not in business. Not in negotiation. Not in the quiet, bloodless warfare of men who settle disputes in private rooms with cognac and contracts that do not require signatures, because everyone at the table understands what the alternative looks like. Then came the night of the explosion. He never spoke about it in detail. His men knew only fragments: a warehouse on the eastern port, a meeting that was supposed to be routine, a device that was not. The fire took 11 seconds to consume the room. 11 seconds that Adrian Moretti spent trying to get to the door, hands outstretched in heat and smoke, lungs filling with ash, vision already dissolving before the ceiling came down. He survived. He should not have. And when he woke in a private hospital room 3 days later, gauze wound around his head and a specialist standing at the foot of his bed wearing an expression that said everything before his mouth opened. Adrian lay completely still and said nothing for a very long time. The damage was permanent. Both eyes complete. The world he had navigated by observation, by reading faces, by catching the smallest muscle movements men tried to hide, that world was gone, sealed, replaced by a darkness so absolute it had weight. He was told to rest. He did not rest. He was advised to delegate. He delegated nothing. What he did instead was listen with a ferocity that unnerved people who had not yet understood that a man stripped of one sense does not become less dangerous. He becomes different, more attuned, more exacting. The way a blade, reforged, comes back sharper along a new edge. But precision requires information, and information requires people you trust. That was the problem, because the explosion had not been an accident. Adrian knew this within a week, knew it from the silences that lasted half a second too long, from the answers that came too quickly and too smoothly, from the texture of loyalty around him that had shifted subtly, barely perceptibly, like sand rearranging itself beneath water. Someone close to him had orchestrated it. Someone who knew his movements, his routes, his schedule, someone who had eaten in his house and spoken in his presence and smiled across tables while calculating his destruction. The blind king could not see faces anymore, but he had learned something the sighted never quite understand. The truth is rarely in what people show you. It lives in what they do not. And in the darkness, deprived of every visual lie, he began hearing too much. The flattening of tone that meant a man had rehearsed. The careful omission tucked inside a report. The professionally neutral cadence of lawyers trying to protect him from information he had not asked to be protected from. Blindness, he learned, did not diminish betrayal. It amplified it, because every lie now had to travel through sound. And sound, unlike expression, could not disguise itself forever. She arrived on a Tuesday. One suitcase, second-hand leather, bronze clasp, slightly bent, the kind of bag that had been somewhere and carried its history without apology. No entourage, no visible nerves. She walked through the front entrance of the Moretti estate, the way people walk through places they have already decided they belong, not with arrogance, but with a quiet, settled certainty that has nothing to prove. The housekeeper, Mrs. Cataneo, a woman who had outlasted 3 estate managers, 1 attempted coup, and 2 men who thought charm would compensate for incompetence, looked her over with the particular thoroughness of someone accustomed to finding people lacking. She found nothing obvious to fault. That irritated her more than incompetence would have. Amara Osei had come recommended through a placement agency in Milan that specialized in domestic staff for high-security households. Her file was clean. Her references were meticulous. Her background check had been run 3 times, once by the agency, once by the estate's legal team, and once by a man named Caruso, who handled the kind of verification that never appeared on invoices. She came back spotless every time. What the file did not capture, could not capture, was the particular quality of her stillness. The way she stood in a room and registered it before she moved through it. The way she listened with her whole body. She was 26, Ghanaian by origin, raised between Accra and London, educated at a university that had sharpened a mind already inclined toward precision. She had worked in 2 other private households before this one. Both had ended when the situations became untenable in ways her files summarized diplomatically, and her expression, when pressed, refused to elaborate on any further. She did not need this job. She had taken it anyway. No one in the house questioned why. People in service do not get asked about their reasons. They get assessed for usefulness, assigned hours, and expected to be grateful for both. Amara was grateful for neither. She was, however, competent in ways that became apparent within 48 hours and quietly indispensable within a week. It was on the 8th morning that Adrian sent for her. He was in the study, seated behind a desk that held nothing decorative, only what had purpose. The curtains were open, which struck her as intentional. A blind man who still chose to face the light. She filed that away without comment. "Who are you?" he asked, without turning his head. He already knew her name. She understood immediately that the question was not about that. "The one making sure nobody lies to you," she said. The room held its breath. Adrian went quiet for a long moment, long enough that a less composed person would have filled the silence, softened the answer, reached for something safer. Amara did not move, did not elaborate, did not retreat. Then something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet. Something closer to recognition. The alertness of a man who has been lied to so consistently that honesty, unadorned and unqualified, registers like an unfamiliar frequency. "Stay," he said, not as an invitation, as a verdict. That was the beginning. Not romantic, nothing that soft. It was transactional at its bones, built on utility, on the simple and radical fact that Amara brought him the truth when everyone else brought him managed versions of it. She read contracts aloud, without editorializing. She described faces at meetings with a journalist's eye for detail. When someone contradicted something they had said 3 days earlier, she told him. When the numbers did not reconcile, she said so immediately and without dressing it in more comfortable language. She did not pity him. This was the thing that undid him, slowly, without his permission. Every person in his orbit, his men, his lawyers, the staff, carried a particular tension in their dealings with him now. The constant micro-adjustment of people navigating a powerful man's wound, too careful, too gentle, the invisible asterisk appended to every interaction. But he is blind. Amara had no asterisk. She spoke to him the way she spoke to rooms directly, without flinching, with the calm assumption that he was capable of handling whatever she said. He was not used to it. He became, without entirely realizing it, dependent on it. The way a man in darkness becomes dependent on a voice that tells him what is actually in front of him, not because the voice is kind, but because in a world engineered to deceive him, it is the only reliable thing left. Trust, in Adrian Moretti's world, was not a feeling. It was an architecture, something constructed with precision, reinforced under pressure, and stress-tested before it was ever leaned upon. He had learned this young, the brutal, efficient lesson, that sentiment is a liability, loyalty is a transaction, and the people who claim to love you most are often simply waiting for the right number. He had never forgotten. He had never stopped believing it, until her. It began, as the most dangerous things do, with something small. A cup of coffee placed at precisely the 11 o'clock position on his desk, not the center, not the right, but exactly where his right hand fell when he reached forward. He had not told her where he preferred it. He had not needed to. She had watched one morning, catalogued the movement, and adjusted without commentary. It was simply there, correct, waiting. 2, 8, 8, 2. He said nothing about it, but he noticed. He noticed everything. The way she ordered the papers on his desk according to how his mind worked rather than how a filing system dictated they should be arranged. The way she paused barely a second, but consistently before entering a room, so the sound of her presence announced itself before the words did. The way she never rearranged anything in the house without telling him first. The chair by the window, I have moved it 18 inches to the left. The lamp in the corridor has been replaced. It sits 2 inches higher than before. The vase in the hall has been removed. You kept brushing it with your shoulder. Small adjustments, constant calibrations. All of them designed, he realized slowly, to ensure that his world did not change without his knowledge. It was the most profound act of respect anyone in that house had shown him since he lost his sight. He stopped eating unless she brought the food. This alarmed the kitchen staff. They brought it to Mrs. Cataneo, who brought it to the estate manager, who made the wise and immediate decision not to bring it to Adrian, because nobody with functioning self-preservation instincts brought Adrian Moretti complaints about Adrian Moretti's preferences. He stopped attending certain meetings unless Amara had briefed him first, not because he could not manage without her, but because her briefings were better, sharper, unfiltered by the political calculations his men performed before they opened their mouths. Where his consigliere would say the situation is manageable, Amara would say Richie hesitated twice before answering, and the second time his voice dropped. He is hiding something in the Palermo account. She could not have known the significance of what she was reporting. She reported it anyway, because she reported everything. Naples, of course, noticed. The city runs on gossip the way it runs on coffee, compulsively and at all hours. The domestic staff talked. The men talked. The women at charity dinners talked over crystal glasses in that low register people use when they want scandal to sound like concern. The Moretti boss trusts his housekeeper more than his own underboss. She reads his correspondence. She sits in rooms she has no business sitting in. He will not sign anything unless she has read it first. They thought it was weakness. The sentimentality of a wounded man reaching for comfort wherever he could find it. They were wrong. What was growing between Adrian Moretti and Amara Osei was not weakness dressed in the clothing of devotion. It was something far more destabilizing. Certainty. In a world built entirely on shifting allegiances, curated truths, and the constant low-frequency hum of paranoia that is the tax on power, Adrian had found one thing he could place his full weight upon, and it would not buckle. He did not examine what that meant beyond its utility. Not yet. But the house felt it. The way a house feels pressure change before a storm. Walls do not speak, but they absorb the altered rhythm of footsteps, the changed texture of silence, the gravitational shift of two people in proximity who have begun, without declaration or permission, to orbit each other. Trust. The most dangerous currency in the world, and Adrian Moretti had given her all of it. Something was wrong. Adrian felt it before he could name it, the way you feel the temperature of a room shift before you find the open window. A formless wrongness, atmospheric and persistent. The kind of thing that keeps a man awake at 3 a.m, mentally inventorying everything that should be fine and finding nothing obviously broken, but still unable to shake the certainty that something is. The money was the first concrete thing. He noticed an irregularity in the quarterly transfer out of the Marseille account, not large enough to trigger automatic alerts, which told him immediately that whoever was moving it understood his systems. 140,000 euros rerouted through a shell in Luxembourg to an account he did not recognize. When he had Amara read the transfer records aloud twice, the second time slowly the pattern emerged. It was not one transfer, it was 9. All small, all just beneath threshold, all routed through respectable-looking intermediaries that would take weeks to untangle. Someone had been extraordinarily careful. Someone had studied the architecture of his finances with the intimacy of a person who had lived inside them. The roots were shifting too. 3 of his port arrangements in Campania had been quietly renegotiated. Through a third party, he did not authorize the new terms, marginally less favorable. The kind of adjustment that looks like administrative friction rather than interference. His transport manager, when questioned, produced explanations that were technically coherent and texturally wrong, smooth in a way that had been rehearsed. Amara told him this in her flat, precise language. He is not lying about the facts. He is lying about the sequence. He knew about the renegotiation before it happened. Adrian said nothing. He was already cataloging the hesitations in his weekly briefings that had begun perhaps 2 months earlier. The specific men who had started delivering information in more compressed form, fewer details, brisker summaries, the conversational equivalent of a room cleaned before company arrives, the names that had quietly stopped appearing in reports altogether. Someone near him was building something, using his resources, his infrastructure, the trust architecture of an empire that had taken him years to construct, disassembling it, piece by careful piece, in the dark where he could not watch. The worst part was not the betrayal itself. The worst part was the shape of it. This was not the work of an outsider, not a rival family, not a competitor circling from a distance. This was intimate. This was someone who knew where the money was kept and how it moved and which thresholds triggered which alarms. Someone who had attended dinners in this house. Someone whose voice he had heard in rooms where the truth was supposed to be safe. "Read it again," he told Amara. She did. Every word, unhurried, neutral, her voice carrying the numbers to him the way good light carries detail without distortion. When she finished, the silence that followed was different from other silences. Adrian sat very still, both hands flat on the desk. Someone near me is betraying me. Not a question, a recognition. The kind a surgeon gives a diagnosis aloud, not because the patient has not already understood it, but because saying it out loud makes the next step possible. Amara was quiet. "How certain are you?" she asked. Completely. She did not offer comfort, did not reach for reassurance, did not soften the edges of what he had just said. She pulled the next sheet from the folder and laid it before him with the deliberate calm of someone who understood that what came next required clarity more than kindness. He was right about the betrayal. He was not yet right about who. Because the truth was not outside the house. It was not in the accounts or the rerouted transfers or the shifting loyalties of port managers in Campania. The truth was on the other side of a door that had been closed for 14 months, sealed in stone. Sleeping, waiting. "I'm not dead, Adrian." The words arrived softly. That was what made them devastating, the softness. Violence, when it comes loudly, gives the body a chance to brace. But Viviana had always understood that the most effective damage is delivered quietly, at close range, in a voice calibrated to sound like reason. Adrian did not move. He was standing near the window, one hand braced against the frame. The position he took when sitting felt too much like surrender. Amara was 2 feet behind him. She had been about to speak. The words were already formed, waiting. And then the door had opened. Viviana Moretti entered the room the way she entered every room she had ever walked into, with a command of space that was less about movement and more about replacement. As though the air itself rearranged to accommodate her. She was immaculate, dark dress, hair swept back, composure sharpened to a blade. The expression of a woman who had prepared for this scene for a very long time and arrived at it without a single unrehearsed impulse. Amara stared. 14 months ago, she had stood at the periphery of the funeral. She had not known Adrian then. Had only just arrived in Naples, had seen the cortege from a distance and registered it the way you register a city's grief without understanding its geography. She had seen the casket, heard the bells, watched people move around, a powerful man with the careful choreography reserved for tragedy and danger. She had accepted, as everyone had accepted, the fact of Viviana Moretti's death. The cliff road north of Sorrento, the vehicle recovered from the water, the body burned beyond easy recognition, identified through records that now felt, in hindsight, disturbingly convenient. The death certificate filed, the mourning observed, the grave filled, and now, here. How? Adrian's voice was something Amara had never heard before. Not the controlled quiet of a man managing information. Not the stillness that preceded his most terrible moods. This was raw. Something that had bypassed every defense he had ever built and arrived naked at the surface. "The accident was real," Viviana said, moving further into the room with the unhurried ease of someone who already knew where every piece of furniture stood. "I simply wasn't in the car when it went over." The body was arranged. Her tone did not change. The same conversational calm, the same faint curve at the corner of her mouth. It is remarkable what becomes possible when you have sufficient money, sufficient timing, and people who know how to stop asking questions. A silence fell over the room that had mass. Amara understood, in that accelerated clarity that comes when multiple structures collapse at once, that she was witnessing not only the return of a dead woman, but the explanation for everything. The missing money, the rerouted transfers, the intimate knowledge of Adrian's systems embedded in the theft that had been running for months beneath the visible surface of his life. Every missing euro had a face now. Every lie had a voice. Viviana looked at Adrian for a long moment and then said, almost lazily, "I was watching." Amara felt that sentence land. Not dead. Watching. Observing his grief, his blindness, his dependency. The slow rebuilding of a life she had stepped away from only to circle back and claim. Adrian's jaw tightened. Why? Viviana's smile widened. "Because leaving quietly," she said, "was never going to give me what I wanted." She let that settle. Let Adrian stand in it with his blind eyes open and his hands very still at his sides, holding himself together with the same iron discipline that had run an empire for a decade. Then her gaze moved to Amara. Slow, deliberate, top to bottom and back again, the comprehensive, annihilating assessment of a woman measuring the person who had occupied her absence. "I see you have been busy," Viviana said. Not to Adrian, to her. Viviana did not return with luggage. She returned with leverage. The luggage followed the next morning, 12 pieces, sent ahead from somewhere, handled by men Amara did not recognize, who moved through the house with the comfortable orientation of people who had been here before. They knew which corridor connected to the East Wing. They knew the service entrance code. They knew Mrs. Catanio's schedule. They knew which cameras had blind spots and which locks were decorative. They had been briefed. This had been planned. Amara catalogued all of it from the first-floor window and felt the sharp, clarifying chill of understanding that she was not witnessing an arrival, but a reoccupation. Viviana had not come back to explain, reconcile, or seek forgiveness for a faked death. She had come back to retake a position, and she had prepared the ground with the same meticulous patience that had moved money out of Adrian's accounts for months without detection. "You forgot your place." The words arrived 2 hours after the luggage. Amara had been in the corridor outside Adrian's study, where she had stood 100 times, waiting or working or thinking. The corridor that had become, without ceremony, one of her spaces in this house. Viviana came around the corner without hurry, holding a cup of tea she had prepared herself, in a kitchen that was no longer hers, in a house she had abandoned, in a life she had engineered her own exit from. Amara turned to face her. "My place," Amara said carefully, "is where Mr. Moretti needs me." "Mr. Moretti," Viviana repeated. The slight emphasis transformed the title into mockery. How formal, how correct. She took a slow sip of tea and looked at Amara over the rim, with eyes doing something more complex than contempt. Measuring, calculating, locating stress fractures. "Whatever you think has grown here in this house, in that room, between you, understand that it grew in a space that was always mine. I was simply not occupying it." "You were dead," Amara said. "I was absent." Viviana's voice did not rise. That was the weapon, the absolute control, the way she delivered devastating things at room temperature. "There is a difference. You would do well to learn it." The war that followed was not fought with weapons. It was fought in inches, in silence, in who he believed, when the truth could not be seen. Viviana began with infrastructure, the domestic staff, the schedules, the flow of information through the house. She reinserted herself into the architecture of daily life, with a speed and precision that suggested she had mapped every change Amara had made and prepared counter-movements in advance. Instructions were redirected. Timetables altered. Meetings rescheduled without notice. Mrs. Cataneo, who had developed a careful respect for Amara over 14 months, now moved with the anxious deference of a woman recalibrating loyalties in real time. Phones went quiet at strategic moments. Messages arrived hours late. 3 of Adrian's men, who had previously spoken to Amara directly, without hesitation, now routed their communications through Viviana's intermediary, a man named Ferretti, who had appeared 2 days earlier under the pretense of restructuring security protocols, and had since embedded himself with alarming ease into the household's operational rhythm. And Adrian. Adrian stood at the center of it, unable to see the lines being redrawn around him, trapped in his own darkness, while the woman he had mourned and the woman he trusted moved in orbit around him, each presenting a version of reality, each version technically built from true things, arranged into carefully engineered conclusions. He stopped sleeping properly. Amara could hear it, the light under his door, at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, the footsteps that moved from desk to window, to door and back. The sound of a man who could not rest because he could not trust what surrounded him and did not yet have enough solid ground to stand on. She left things for him, quietly, without announcement, a glass of water at his door at midnight. A folder left at the corner of his desk containing documents she had organized before Ferretti could intercept them. Handwritten notes in the format she knew he processed best, brief, sequential, stripped of softness. She did not know if they were reaching him. She did not stop sending them, because Viviana was playing a long game with considerable preparation behind her. But she had made one fundamental miscalculation. She had assumed 14 months of proximity could be undone by the prior claim of a marriage certificate. She did not understand what had actually been built in those 14 months. She had never been afraid of the dark. Amara had learned how to live inside it. It happened in the main hall. Amara, in retrospect, should have anticipated the location. Viviana possessed a theatrical instinct that understood the value of setting. High ceilings, marble floors, the kind of room that made voices carry and witnesses feel the weight of what they were observing. A stage, in every meaningful sense. She had walked in to deliver Adrian his evening briefing, the nightly summary she had maintained for months, the ritual that had become the fixed point of his days. The folder was in her hand. The content was significant. She had found another transfer, this one larger, routed through a name she had finally been able to trace through 3 layers of corporate fiction to a property in Positano, registered 18 months earlier, registered in Viviana Moretti's name, 4 months before the funeral. Before the death that was not a death. She got as far as the entrance to the hall. Viviana was already there. "You're doing it again," Viviana said, without turning. Her voice had lost some of its earlier control. Something hot and sharp had begun to fray beneath the polish. Every evening, like clockwork, the little briefing, the documents, the indispensable housekeeper. The last word landed with all the contempt she had saved for it. How domestic. "I have information Mr. Moretti needs." "Mr. Moretti," Viviana said, spinning now, "is my husband. Whatever information passes through this house passes through me. You are staff, Amara. You have always been staff. And whatever confusion the last year has produced in your understanding of your position, there is no confusion," Amara said. The evenness in her own voice surprised her. Viviana crossed the space between them. "How dare you?" she said. And now the composure finally cracked, not dramatically, but the way a fracture runs through glass before it gives way. "How dare you stand in my house and look at me like that? Like you belong here, like you have the right?" The slap came fast, loud as a gunshot in that marble room, hard enough to turn Amara's head. The sound did not fade. It stayed, hanging in the air like something that had just rewritten the rules of the house. Amara did not fall. She stood, one hand lifting slowly to her cheek, and looked at Viviana Moretti with something that was not rage and not tears and not the performance of either. Something quiet and clear and very still, the expression of a person who has just received the final piece of information required to understand exactly where she stands. "Don't touch her." Adrian's voice arrived from the doorway. He had heard it. Of course he had heard it. The sound had traveled through walls, and he had trained himself to read this house the way he once read faces. He stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, blind eyes open, chest moving with controlled fury. He could not move quickly enough, could not have stopped it, could not place himself between Amara and that violence. The impotence of it, the inability to shield her, to intercept what had already happened, transformed on his face into something beyond anger, something foundational. The devastation of a man confronting the exact limit of his own power at the precise moment it mattered most. Viviana straightened, smoothed her sleeve, looked at Adrian with the practiced composure of someone who had perhaps planned for this too, knowing it would make him look helpless, knowing that the blind king, unable to protect the woman he trusted, would be its own form of damage. She provoked, "Get my lawyer," Adrian said, quiet, deadly, absolute, not a request, not addressed to Viviana. Viviana's composure faltered, because she had prepared for rage, for accusation, for the kind of messy, emotional confrontation she had already rehearsed countermoves for. She had not prepared for this. for the quality of calm that descends on a man who has made an irreversible decision and no longer requires performance from anyone in the room. Amara stood very still. Her cheek burned. The folder in her hand had gone damp where her fingers tightened around it. The room was silent in the way rooms become silent after something breaks that cannot be repaired. And in that silence, something settled. Final. Like the last piece of a structure locking into place. The lawyer arrived within the hour. Marco Fanucci, a man so old and so deeply embedded in the legal skeleton of the Moretti Empire that the two had become nearly indistinguishable. He entered the house with his briefcase and his gray suit and his expression of practiced neutrality, and he took a seat across from Adrian without requiring instruction. He had received calls like this before. He understood the register. Amara retreated to the corridor. Not because she had been excluded, Adrian had turned toward her when Fanucci arrived. That unerring orientation he had developed. Blind eyes finding her position with a precision that still undid her slightly, and she had understood from his stillness that her nearness was wanted, even if her presence in the room was not yet. So she stayed close and listened. The words that came through the door over the next 40 minutes were not loud. Adrian's voice never rose. That was, she had learned, the surest sign of seriousness. The quieter he became, the more irrevocable the thing being said. Fraud, conspiracy, theft. The legal vocabulary of a man laying out a case with the methodical precision of someone who had been building it in his mind for longer than anyone in that room had realized. Fanucci asked questions. Adrian answered without hesitation, without consulting notes, because he had been running numbers in his head for weeks, long before tonight. Long before the slap and the marble hall and the fracture of whatever composure he had continued extending toward the woman he had once buried. He had known. Not the full shape of it, not Viviana specifically, not until Amara had traced the Positano property and placed the document in his hand. But he had known the betrayal was close and intimate and rooted in the past, and he had been patient with the knowledge in the way only those who understand the cost of moving too early can be patient. He had waited for certainty. He had it now. Everything came out in the days that followed. The money, 4 million euros total, extracted over 18 months, beginning 4 months before the funeral, through a network of shells Viviana had constructed before she vanished. A scaffolding so carefully designed that it had taken Amara's particular combination of precision and distrust of smooth explanations to find the load-bearing points. The intermediary, Ferretti, a former associate of Viviana's, planted in the house to monitor Adrian's recovery and report on the estate's vulnerabilities. He was gone before the second morning, escorted out with the quiet efficiency of men who had been waiting for permission. The port arrangements in Campania, renegotiated on Viviana's instruction through a proxy, the unfavorable terms designed to weaken Adrian's standing with partners over time. Slow structural damage dressed as administrative adjustment. And the death, the staged, choreographed, meticulously resourced false death, reverse-engineered from insurance records, property transfers, account activity, and the timeline itself, which told a story of a woman planning her exit and return simultaneously. She had never meant the disappearance to be permanent. She had used 14 months of Adrian's grief, blindness, and isolation as setup. Return as the resurrected wife. Reclaim the empire. Displace the threat. Viviana Moretti had built an extraordinarily sophisticated play. She lost. Not because her plan failed in mechanics, the mechanics were nearly flawless. She lost because she had constructed her strategy around a version of Adrian that no longer existed. The man who needed her, depended on her, whose empire could be accessed through the intimacy of marriage. She had not accounted for the last 14 months, had not understood what had been built in the darkness by a woman with one suitcase, no performance, and the devastating habit of telling him the truth. The empire did not fall. She did. Quietly, legally, Without the grand confrontation she may once have imagined, a fraud case filed through Fanucci's office, asset freezes, the Positano property seized, criminal proceedings initiated through channels so clean and procedurally exact that there was nothing to contest, no martyrdom to claim, no chaos in which she could recast herself as victim. Viviana left the house on a Thursday morning. She did not say goodbye. The house absorbed the departure the way houses absorb everything: the sound of the door, the altered pressure in the air, the unmistakable sensation of strain finally releasing after weeks of quiet compression. Amara was in the garden. She heard the car. She did not watch it leave. She stood with her face turned toward the sky above Naples. The city audible in its usual state, alive, unimpressed, continuous, when she heard footsteps behind her. The particular footsteps she knew better than any sound in the world now. The measured, deliberate gait of a man who had learned to navigate darkness by trusting what he could hear, what he could feel, and what he could know. He stopped beside her, not reaching, not speaking immediately, just present the warmth of him, the weight of everything they had survived together settling around them in the late afternoon air. "Stay," he said. The same word, the first word, really. The word that had started all of it in the study on a morning when she was a stranger with a suitcase and he was a man stranded in the dark. But different now, heavier, full of everything it had accumulated between then and this moment. Amara was quiet for a long time. The city moved around them. The light was changing, that particular Naples light, gold at the edges, the kind that makes the world look briefly like it might be worth keeping. Some choices change everything, not only the future of the person making them, but the shape of every day that comes after. She turned toward him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. And for the first time since the fire took his sight, Adrian Moretti knew exactly who was standing in front of him.